Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about the frontal bone. The frontal bone is an unpaired bone that lies at the interface between the neurocranium and viscerocranium, with the neurocranial part forming the superior portion of the bone and the facial part forming the inferior portion. The frontal bone borders anteriorly and medially with the two nasal bones at the frontonasal suture to create the nasion. From medial to lateral, it connects to the lacrimal bone at the frontolacrimal suture, with the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone at the frontoethmoidal suture forming part of the medial wall of the orbit, with the frontal process of the maxilla at the frontomaxillary suture laterally to the nasal bone, with the sphenoid bone at the sphenofrontal suture, laterally with the zygomatic bone at the frontozygomatic suture, and finally with the parietal bones posteriorly at the coronal suture. On the external surface, the frontal bone contributes to the formation of bregma, the bony landmark where the sagittal and the coronal suture meet, and the coronal suture between the posterior aspect of the frontal bone and the parietal bones. Another landmark is pterion, formed by the union of four cranial bones: frontal, parietal, sphenoid, and temporal. The main function of the frontal bone is to provide a protection for the frontal lobe of the cerebrum and to form part of the orbital cavity of which it forms much of the roof. Frontal cranial bones have a greater thickness than the more lateral temporal bones. As a result, these fractures require a more forceful mechanism of injury than other facial bone fractures. The frontal bone consists of four parts: the squamous part, the nasal part, two orbital plates, and two zygomatic processes. We can subdivide the frontal bone into two portions: a vertical portion, or squama, that has an external and an internal surface, and an horizontal portion, or orbital, that has a superior and an inferior surface. The external surface of the superior portion of the frontal bone is vertical in orientation and comprises the forehead or frontal squama, the largest part of the bone. At the beginning of life, it is a bone separated by a temporary suture called the frontal or metopic suture. It then transforms into a singular bone absent the suture in most cases. It may fuse as early as 3 months of age and should fuse in nearly all patients by around 9 months of age. The external surface of the inferior portion of the bone is shaped by the complex morphology of the supraorbital region. Modern human brow ridge development varies by population and, if present, is usually characterized mainly by pronounced supraciliary arches and by the supraorbital arch. The supraciliary arches, or supraorbital ridges, are two smooth curved elevations. Each superciliary arch extends laterally from the glabella and travels towards a zygomatic process of the frontal bone over the medial third to half of the orbit. They divide the squamous part from the orbital part of the bone. The supraorbital arch has been further subdivided into the supraorbital margin and the supraorbital trigonum. The supraorbital margins are the two prominent curved edges that form the superior portion of the opening of each orbit. They begin at the supraorbital foramen and extends to the frontozygomatic suture. The supraorbital margin also extend under the lateral portion of the supraciliary arch, but in this case it is always interrupted by a supraorbital sulcus. The term supraorbital sulcus refers to a discontinuity or groove between the supraciliary arch and supraorbital arches, typically located along the bony portion above the middle line of each orbit. The supraorbital trigonum is the most lateral portion of this region between the supraorbital foramen and the zygomaticofrontal suture. The frontal eminences, or frontal tuberosity, are the two round prominent anterolaterally located areas where the convexity of the frontal bone is at its maximum. Laterally and inferiorly from the supraorbital margin begins the zygomatic process of the frontal bone that articulates with the zygomatic bone to form the frontozygomatic suture. The supraorbital nerve, the direct continuation of the frontal nerve, exits the orbit through the supraorbital notch or foramen and is distributed to the forehead and the scalp, upper eyelid, and also the frontal sinus. A projection of the frontal bone extends downward and forward from the center of the nasal part, the nasal spine. It articulates with the nasal bones and with the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Along the superior margin of the orbit, there's a notch that sometimes turns into a hole, known as the frontal notch or frontal foramen. This foramen, located medial to the supraorbital foramen, lets the medial branch of supraorbital nerve pass through, whereas the lateral branch goes through the supraorbital foramen. The frontal bones remain separated until after birth by the frontal or metopic suture. Synostotic fusion of this suture takes place during the second postnatal year and unites into a single frontal bone by 7 years of age. In a lateral view, we can see the squamous part of frontal bone that extends into the temporal fossa region, forming the temporal surface of frontal bone. The two temporal lines provide an attachment site for the temporal fascia. From an inferior view, we can see the orbital and nasal portion. The portion of the bone which projects downwards between the supraorbital margins is named the nasal part. In the midline of the orbital part, we find the ethmoidal notch where the ethmoid articulates with the frontal bone. In front of the ethmoidal notch and lateral to the nasal spine are situated the openings of the frontal sinuses. The ethmoidal air cells, also known as the ethmoidal sinuses, form one of the 4 pairs of paranasal sinuses. They are located within each side of the lateral mass or labyrinth of the ethmoid bone. The frontal recess, also known as the nasofrontal duct, is a duct through which either frontal sinus drains into the nasal cavity. Since the nasofrontal duct is rarely a distinct duct, nasal frontal outflow tract is the more appropriate term. Another part that we can see from these views is the sphenoidal margin of the frontal bone, an area where the frontal bone meets the greater wings of the sphenoid bone, helping to make up the lateral wall of the eye socket. Another sphenoidal margin is found where the posterior edges of the orbital plates of the frontal bone meet the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone, forming the floor of the anterior cranial fossa in the cranial cavity. Moving laterally, we see the roof of the orbit. The orbital surface of each orbital plate is smooth and concave and presents 2 depressions: the fossa for the lacrimal gland where the lacrimal gland is located, and the trochlear fovea in the nasal side of the inferior surface of the frontal bone's orbital plate. This depression serves as an attachment site for the cartilaginous pulley of the superior oblique muscle, which is essential for moving the eye, a muscle that receives innervation from the trochlear nerve. Thus, the trochlear nerve gets its name precisely because it innervates the only muscle in the eye whose tendon passes within the trochlear fovea. Sometimes, a tiny bony prominence known as the trochlear spine is present, providing a spot where the cartilaginous pulley can attach. The opening of frontal sinus is integral to its connection with the nasal cavity, facilitated through a descending bony passage known as the frontonasal duct. This duct allows the sinus to clear mucus and other secretions into the nose. The frontal sinus is one of the most variable human anatomical structures. The frontal sinus usually consists of 2 air-filled volumes situated behind the right and left part of the forehead. They are separated by the frontal septum in the sagittal plane. In the frontal sinus floor, there is a conically tapering constriction, the frontal sinus infundibulum, that leads to the smallest constriction of the passage to the frontal sinus, the frontal ostium. It is the opening of the frontal sinus to the natural frontal sinus outflow tract, or frontal recess. The frontal sinus outflow tract leads downward around the Agarnase cell into the nasal cavity. From here, there exists a path which leads past the middle turbinate to the nostril and the outside air. Unlike the other sinuses, the frontal sinus is absent at birth. The sinuses can begin forming in individuals as young as 2 years of age. However, they often are not visible radiographically until approximately 6 years of age. Growth ceases at about 20 years of age, when the shape and size of the sinus becomes stable. From the inner or endocranial surface of the frontal bone, we can see a median ridge on the internal surface of the vertical part of the human frontal bone, called frontal crest. At the base of the frontal crest is located a small opening in the anterior cranial fossa, the foramen cecum, one of the points of origin of the falx cerebri, which in its course also attaches to the frontal crest. From this view, we can see the frontal branch of the middle meningeal artery that branches off the maxillary artery, an extension of the external carotid artery. Summarizing, from this anterior perspective, we can see the 2 frontal eminences, the metopic suture, the supraorbital foramen, point of passage of the supraorbital nerve, the supraorbital margin, the glabella, the nasal spine of the frontal foramen, the zygomatic process of the frontal bone, and the supraciliary arch. Changing perspective, we can see again the nasal spine, the supraorbital foramen, the frontal foramen, the trochlear fovea to which the pulley for the tendon of the superior oblique muscle attaches, the lacrimal fossa in which the lacrimal gland, draining into the lacrimal duct in the nose, is located, the ethmoidal cells, which help to add resonance to the voice and decrease the overall weight of the skull. The opening of the frontal sinus, the ethmoidal notch, point of articulation with the ethmoid bone, the sphenoidal margin, point of union with the sphenoid bone, and the roof of the orbit which the frontal helps to form. From the lateral perspective we can see the sphenoid margin, the temporal fossa which mainly houses the temporalis muscle. The fossa has as its anterior and superior boundaries the superior temporal line, the point where the temporalis fascia attaches, and the inferior temporal line, point of origin of the temporalis muscle, and finally the coronal suture. From a posterior view we can see again the nasal spine, the foramen cecum, point of insertions of the falx cerebri, the frontal crest, the bony ridge on the inner surface of the squama, further attachment point of the falx cerebri, which above it continues always on the midline with the groove for the superior sagittal sinus. Finally, we see the groove for the middle meningeal artery that vascularizes the lateral part of the skull. We have concluded for today. I recommend these videos for other topics you might be interested in.